Sometimes we know better, but don't do better. Why is that? Have you ever thought about that? Why is that the case? Because in many instances, I know for me personally, that tends to be true as well, right? Like, I know what I should do, but sometimes I don't always do the very things I should do. Think about it from this perspective. How about New Year's resolutions? Anybody ever had a New Year's resolution before? Or maybe a little bit more practical to the time that we're in right now. It's the beginning of a school year, and we get to start things brand new. Whether it's resolutions, the beginning of a school year, maybe it's the beginning of the month, maybe you're one of those every Monday you start over. It's like, okay, this is a time to start fresh. You know why we constantly are doing that? Because we inherently know what is best for us. We know we need to lose the weight. We know we need to be more disciplined. We know we need to exercise better. We know these things, but so rarely do we actually do these things. In fact, if believing was all it took, wouldn't we have such a better life? I mean, you think about your health. Me personally, I'm a kinesiology major, which means my degree at A&M was in the study of movement. I had to take a nutrition class. I had to prescribe exercise plans for people. That was my major when I was at Texas A&M. But yet I know everything that I should do, but how frequently do I tell my bride, I'm like, babe, I really should stop eating this value meal. Maybe eating Chick-fil-A twice a day is not the best plan of attack, right? I mean, it's good chicken, but what about financial? I mean, we believe we know what is best for us, right? We have the belief that if I will just act my wage, I will not be in debt. But how often do we actually act our wage? We believe so much, but the truth is that most of us know exactly what we should do. But how often do we actually carry it out? I mean, the problem for us is not a lack of information. If we're honest, it's not that we don't have the information. We know we need to be generous. We know we need to be compassionate. We know we need to forgive in times. And the problem isn't that we need to know or that we need to believe better, because we know and we believe. We know what is there, and we believe what can really make our lives better. But the problem is that so rarely do we actually follow through in that. In fact, I could make the argument that we would be better off in just about every area of our life if all we had to do was believe. Jesus understood that as well. In fact, Jesus knew that believing wasn't enough. And Jesus knew the propensity that we had. He knew what was going on behind us. He knew the struggles that we would have. And that's why what Jesus did is he didn't invite people to believe or to know about him. Jesus actually invited people to do something. He invited people to do things with their life. He invited people to go and to do, because he knew that doing would make all the difference in the world. In fact, this next statement that is remarkable. I think this could be, if anything, this might be something you write home and you just check out of the rest of the message, and that's okay. But one of the things I found, in fact, I'm a fan of TED Talks. I don't know if you've ever watched many TED Talks. It's not a bunch of talks by a guy named Ted. It is actually a bunch of talks. They're 12 to 15 minutes. Sometimes they're as short as 3 minutes, but they're all about technology and education and design and doing different things and figuring out ways and learning from other people's learnings. And I heard a TED Talk one time that made the comment that if you have a dream, if you have a desire, if you have decided that you want to do something and you believe it could be remarkable, that if you tell somebody, it could actually be counterproductive. Because when you tell somebody your dream, what you're doing is you're getting the accolades, you're getting the praise before you actually put it into action. And what he went on to say is that oftentimes the accolades of just thinking about a dream sometimes keep us from actually doing anything with our dream. You see, when we believe but don't do, our dreams don't come true. When we believe something but we don't do anything with it, it is really difficult for the dreams that we have. I mean, you might be on the cusp of being a remarkable entrepreneur, but the problem is if you just believe what your product can do but you don't do anything with your product, your dream's not going to come true. I love Shark Tank. They rip that apart. They're like, hey, okay, this is a great product, but what are you doing? I'm not investing in somebody that's not doing something. You see, ultimately, when it comes down to our life, doing makes all the difference in the world. That believing is valuable, but belief without doing can be very detrimental. In fact, if we believe and we don't do, what it does is it turns our faith into feeble and fragile and frail. And so that's why we are looking at and talking about how we collectively can create within us a faith that is awe-inspiring, a faith that absolutely would move the heart of our Heavenly Father. In fact, today we're in part 2 of a series that we've entitled Faithful. It's fueling your faith in a world that is on empty. You know, it's interesting because Jesus' agenda, whenever he began talking about and encouraging disciples or the followers, the people that were around him, his agenda was typically one that he wanted to inspire his followers, those around him, to have this awe-inspiring, remarkable, audacious faith. In fact, that was really the only thing, as we looked at last week, the only thing that really that amazed Jesus was either the remarkable faith of individuals or the lack of faith of individuals is what really inspired or encouraged or hurt God, that he was moved by faith, which explains his invitation. I mean, his invitation to individuals throughout his ministry was, follow me. His invitation was, hey, why don't you pick up your net and follow me? Hey, why don't you leave your family and follow me? Hey, why don't you follow after me? But the problem is when we begin to follow, there's a relational, there's interactive, there's value in it. But it's challenging. It can be difficult at times. I mean, if you want me to do something with what I know, that can be challenging. So in many instances, and this is what I grew up in, this is, as a youth pastor previously, this is what when we wanted teenagers, you wanted to make the leaders of the church happy. All you had to do is talk about how many students, and I know this is going to sound really bad, and I apologize, but how many students we guilted to come walk down an aisle and check a box, and then I go talk to somebody and I say, hey, look at what I did. And they're like, oh my goodness, high five. That if we can get individuals to just believe something, that we feel like we've done something. Jesus' invitation was never, would you believe in me? It was follow me. Jesus was action-oriented. He wanted to get you to move the ball down the court. He didn't want to just settle with believe in me, because believe in me is a lot easier and it's a lot safer, and ultimately it doesn't require a whole lot of change. You can believe in something and not do something. We learn that every year with New Year's resolutions. I believe if I will just lose weight, my life will be better, but hey, January 4th, all of a sudden you're celebrating the new year and you've got Bluebell in front of you and you're like, I believe this Bluebell is better than my self-desire, so I'm going to put a little chocolate syrup on that. Life is going to be right. But believe in me is something that makes life easy. But when we really begin to say, God, what does it look like? He looks at those around him and he says, would you follow me? You see, Jesus invited people to live a life that reflects their confidence in God. He invited them not just to live a life where they just check a box and do their own thing. He wanted to change the dynamic of life. He wanted to encourage them to live a life that showcased that they were confident that God was with them and that God was for them. Because ultimately, God is most honored by our living, active, death-defying, in spite of faith. He's most honored by our living, our active, death-defying, in spite of faith. I mean, it's true of you as well, isn't it? If you're a few minutes late for a meeting and you've got several people around and somebody begins to speak about your character, they're like, hey, look, I know they're a little bit late, but they'll be here. This isn't like them. When somebody begins to put trust in the gap instead of suspicion, it honors you. It makes you might not even know that happened, but when you live a life where people can speak up for your character, when they trust your character, it honors the person you're speaking of. And in the same way, when it comes to trusting God, putting our confidence in God, that God is most honored when we live out this active, death-defying, in spite of faith. And this takes on different parameters. This takes on different realities, doesn't it? Because in many instances, we find ourselves in a place where we are empty. We find ourselves trying to navigate the uncertainties of life. We find ourselves trying to navigate what does it look like. And when we see people that have lived out this death-defying, this death-defying, living, active, in spite of faith, it can be an encouragement to us. In fact, when we see somebody live it out and their confidence grows, they see God come through in the midst of it, it inspires me. I've seen countless people that I look back and I think, what in the world? How in the world can you have such faith? Do you understand what you're going through? And they continue to move forward. They continue to do things that seem so out of character, but yet they trust God regardless. What would I do? What would I do if I was confident God was with me? I think that's another way of asking that question. The people that I've seen in the face of struggles and heartache, they have been able to wake up every day and answer this question. I want to live my life today confident that God is with me. What would it look like if I were to go to work tomorrow? What would it look like if I were to parent? What would it look like if I walked into the hospital knowing the outcome or knowing what is on the table for somebody I love, somebody I value, somebody close to me? What would it look like if I faced the horrible struggles in the hospital and I was confident that God was with me? What would it look like if I faced that meeting with the boss and he's downsizing, right? The economy's going down. We got to slim up. We got to be, and you are on the other side of that pink slip. What would it look like for you if you were confident God was with me, even in those times where it seems empty? So what we want to look at today and what we want to answer is, how do we have that kind of faith? What does it look like? Over the course of a lifetime, ultimately, what fuels and facilitates the development of active and enduring faith? Over the course of a lifetime, what is it that fuels, what is it that facilitates an active, death-defying, regardless of what I face, regardless of what's in front of me, I'm going to be confident that God is with me in and through everything. So one of the things that we wanted to really get into is, what are these ingredients? What are the essential ingredients to ensure that we can collectively have this active, death-defying faith? Because we want to figure out, how do we stir this all together? How do we ensure that if we put the right things around us, if we start looking at life through the correct lenses, we will be able to see and experience what it looks like to have this audacious, incredible faith? You know, it's interesting, when you ask somebody about their faith story, the things we're going to be talking about over this series, they come to the forefront relatively quickly. And the first thing, in fact, we refer to these 5 ingredients. We're not going to talk about all of them today, but we refer to them as the 5 faith catalysts. You might have heard us talk about this before, but there are these catalysts that we can see in our lives that can help inspire our faith. In fact, there's things, there's ideas, there's realities that when we begin to look at life, we can see these come up. I see it countlessly. I see it in my own life. I see it in other people's lives. I love hearing other people's faith story because so often these ingredients come up relatively quickly. And the first one we're going to look at today, and we call it practical teaching. This idea that when you go and you hear something, that there's handles. I mean, all of us, I've heard from many different stories of individuals that they began their faith journey when they heard somebody that took the Bible and they made it applicable. They took the stories that are located within the New Testament, within the Jewish scriptures. They took those stories, and all of a sudden, the way they taught, what they said, all of a sudden, it put everything together, and it blew up and it grew up my faith. Like, I don't know how to explain it, but I've never heard the Bible talked like that before. You see, when our active faith intersects with God's faithfulness, our faith grows. When we see and experience that, okay, there was great teaching, that was something I need to put into my life, and when I apply it to my life and I see God's faithfulness in the midst of it, I begin to see that my faith grows because God came through. You see, faithfulness to God, it intersects our faithfulness, or when we really begin to wrestle with this, oftentimes God's faithfulness to us will intersect when we become obedient to Him. When we hear somebody that says, hey, you know what, the next step might be that you need to forgive, and you begin to open up that door of forgiveness and you walk through, even though everything inside of you saying, I don't even want to see that person, and you walk forward and you say, you know what, would you forgive me? I'm taking ownership of what I've done. You know what happens in those moments is it exercises our faith muscle. We have this muscle, this faith muscle, that when we begin to actively apply the things that Jesus would call us to do, it grows our muscle. As a kinesiology major, as I said earlier, I know how, action, origin, insertion. I know there's muscles and you begin to work them out, and that's what I used to do. I don't do that anymore. All I do is walk up and down stairs with boys on my lap. That is a workout enough for me right now, right? And so, But you understand that in order to see a muscle grow, you've got to exert energy and you've got to do something with it. In fact, as we said last time, the idea that trust is the currency for any relationship. In order for us to really begin to step forward, to see our faith grow, we've got to trust the relationship. We've got to begin to say, okay, I'm going to trust that God has got this. I'm going to go forward with confidence that there's something I need to do in my life, and I'm going to follow through. You see, this was really the theme of Jesus' teachings. Jesus would go through and he taught with incredible gusto. In fact, when he would teach, people would constantly be just amazed at the authority with which he taught with. And he taught with great stories, and typically every story, it had an application. He moved them to action. And in fact, it was so challenging at times, it was practical in many instances. In fact, Jesus introduces this upside-down kingdom ethic. Leading into this, everybody just believed, right? It was the Judaic law. It was the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. All you had to do was just believe, and all of a sudden Jesus came and he turned things upside down. He began to ask people to do things. In fact, it required so much of people that it might not be so practical after all. Maybe it's easier to just believe than it is to actually do the things Jesus told people to do. One of his famous sermons, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew documents it, Luke documents it. I mean, think about the things that he said in the sermon. He said that we are to turn the other cheek. When somebody comes at you, you're to turn the other cheek. And I'll be honest, as a dad, when it comes to my boys at recess, if somebody hits them, like everything inside of me wants to be, oh boy, if he hits you, I'm coming after that kid. But before I get there, you make sure you lay him out. You got that, right? But Jesus didn't necessarily lay that as the ethic. He said, when somebody comes, turn the other cheek. He would say things like, if somebody asks you to do something for them, don't just stop at what they ask. Go beyond. If somebody wants your shirt, don't just give them your shirt. Give them your jacket too. He said, don't just pray for your family. Pray for your enemies as well. I mean, who does that? He would go on and talk about this idea that we need to forgive as Christ has forgiven us. He would talk about this idea that you've heard about this yank the plank, that when you see somebody that's doing something wrong and you're like, oh, I need to tell you, it is my responsibility to hold you accountable. He's saying, hey, before you step into anybody else's business, I want you to make sure that you look in the mirror and you pull the plank out of your eye first. You see, Jesus turned things upside down. He required action. It wasn't simply believe me. It was, would you do this with me? And so at the very end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus offers a challenge for them. He concludes this up and he says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine everyone who hears these words of mine and believes them. That would be nice. Everyone who hears these words of mine and they grab their journal and they write it down and they work their hardest to put it into memory, but that's about where it. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and does. It's not simply about believing. And everybody who hears these words and puts them into practice. What? Isn't it easier just to believe? Do I need to really put this? Do I really need to pull the plank? Do I really need to turn the other cheek? It would be so much easier if I didn't have to do all of these things. If I could just believe that this would work. But Jesus asked them to put it into practice. Why? Because then he goes on, he says, the person who puts it into practice is like a wise man. What's a wise man? I mean, we all want to be a wise man. A wise man is somebody who connects the dots, who sees that behaviors lead to outcomes. A wise man is somebody who understands that if I do A, that B will be the result. A wise man sees what's happening and decides to order his life in such a way that he wants to make wise decisions and not simply just, whatever comes may come. He goes on, he says, whoever puts it into practice is a wise man who built his house. Wouldn't we all like to build a house today in this currency? Well, imagine if you got the chance to build a house and you didn't have to pay for it today. Let's rephrase that. Like house values are going through the roof. But he's like a wise man who built his house on the rock. See, we don't really know much about building a house on a rock. What we do is we dig a big hole, we pour a lot of concrete, we lay a foundation, and all is well. But back in the day when Jesus was talking, the people he was talking to, what they would do is they had one of two things. And many people, the ones that wanted to ensure that their house would stay still, their house would stay standing, they would go the extra mile. They would go and they would find rock and they would dig a hole and they would make sure that the foundation of their house was laid on rock and not simply the sand or whatever was underneath. And the beautiful thing about that is when you put your house on the rock, when you have that as a foundation and storms come, you have a firm foundation to help protect you against what happens in life. And he's saying that the wise man, the wise man's going to build his house on the rock. Which leads us to a little bit bigger question. Why would they do that? In order to do that, you've got to trust the individual that is giving you those directions. And Jesus is leaving this question in the air that if you want to be wise, I want to encourage you, will you trust me? Will you trust that what I have to say for your life, that if you do these hard things, if you follow me, that it really will help your life and it will grow up and blow up your faith? You see, he then goes on and he gives us another illustration of what happens, the future of doers. That all of a sudden the rain comes down, the streams rose, and the winds blew, and it beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because its foundation was on the rock. I've lived around hurricanes. I've lived south where there's been great floods. I mean, it's fascinating what floods can do. And in this day and age, they understood that flash floods were a reality. And if the flood were to rise quickly, it could cost you your life. not only your life, it could also cost you everything you have. If a flood were to take your house out, it could take out all of your belongings and leave you with nothing. So they understood the hurdle and the tension that I want to build my house on the rock. But he continues and he says, but there's another person in this story, there's another character, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. Everyone who doesn't listen to this, who doesn't trust me in the process, is like a foolish person who put their house on the sand and the waves came and crashed it down and left you with nothing. You see, the implications of this are quite stunning when we begin to think about church, right? I mean, for me, I grew up in a culture where in many instances it was believe, believe, believe. Like if you'll just admit and believe and confess, you too can be saved. Who wants to be baptized today? I mean, we had the pastor I grew up in, I could mimic him. In fact, we did. When he would go up to baptize people, we would say the exact words that he was about to say. Charlie, back to you. You know, like it was, what in the world is going on? That all you had to do, if it was this easy believism. And what happens with easy believism is when the rains come down and the wind blows through, isn't it true that it's so easy to uncheck? When all of a sudden we're faced with this dynamic, a health diagnosis that we do not want to see. We're like, we've done everything right, God. God, I have prayed every prayer. I get up in the morning and I read my Bible and yeah, I know I need to be doing what I say, but it's not about that. Like, God, I've got so many rhythms in my life that are so great, but I just don't do anything with it. Isn't it true that when we live this out and we just check the box of belief without actually doing, that when the storms come, it can undermine the faith that you and I have. And it can quickly cause us to question. In fact, as painful as it sounds, believing can be deceiving. Believing can be deceiving at times. And if you're not a Christian in here, if you're not a follower of Jesus, I want to say thank you for being here this morning. But isn't it true that for many individuals that have either unchecked faith, they've stepped away from the church, or maybe they've never believed in the first place, in many instances it's because they've run into Christians who believe one thing but live a life that's completely contrary to the thing that they say they believe. That they will say that I'm a follower of Jesus, but they don't live their lives much like Jesus lived his life. They enjoy being in a country club where they can check their box for their membership and pay their dues and then go out and live a life that's not necessarily changed. And for many people who have unchecked or who've run away from the faith, it's because of people like me that say one thing and then require people to do something else or live my life in a completely different way than what I say. If you think Jesus was a little harsh, Jesus' brother James, it's just fascinating. I mean, what would it take for you to believe that your older brother was the Son of God? I mean, I don't know about you, but it would take probably a resurrection for me to sit there and be like, all right, you must be the Son of God. Like, I lived my life in the shadow of a dude who could do no wrong. James, my goodness, I've got so much respect for James. I was the older brother. I tried to put the bar as low as I could, and both of my brothers, younger brothers, they succeeded. They passed with flying colors because I helped them out. I put the bar really low. Listen to what James would say. He says, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Don't just listen. Don't just check the box. Don't just believe. Don't merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. You see, believing doesn't do anything. Faith is a muscle. We've got to work that muscle out. We've got to exercise it with great regularity, because any muscle that we don't exercise, it atrophies. Any muscle we don't exercise, it just kind of begins to be just limp. It doesn't do anything. We've got to exercise that muscle as much as we can. James would say, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Put it into action. Make it grow. And then he goes into this mirror illustration. I don't know if I would encourage you, it's fascinating. Go home, look at James, the brother of Jesus. He wrote a letter. It's in the back half of the New Testament. It's real, if you have a Bible, just turn to the very end and then just slowly make your way back from the right. But James goes into this mirror illustration where he begins to say that if you don't do anything, it's as if you go walk up to a mirror. You look in the mirror and you realize, oh my goodness, my hair is ridiculous. My ears, I don't know how in the world did I get marker on my ears? What is going on? You walk up and you're like, oh, wait a second, I've got horrible breath. This is not okay. My bathrobe, it has stains on it. All right, time to go to work. And you just keep the bathrobe on and you go right on to work. And you just go not worrying about what you look like at all. I mean, for all of us, right? If that were us, we care more about our appearance than we do about what we're about to do. And so at least I do. Y'all are probably better than me, all right? But you're probably one. I mean, I come to church to set up in shorts and a t-shirt. And then I change because I'm like, I'm a nerd like that, right? We want to look in the mirror and we want to correct ourselves based upon what we see in the mirror. And James is saying, if you merely listen to the word and you don't do what it says, it's as if you go into the mirror and you see everything that's wrong with you. And then you're like, all right, sounds good. I'll walk on. Like, who does that? Like Jesus, James adds a promise to this. He says, but whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom, which following Jesus should always lead us to feeling free. Whoever looks intently to the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. If you look into it and you put it into practice, James gives a promise that you'll be blessed in what you do. Jesus would have a version similar to this, as we read earlier. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew, beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. It had its foundation on the rock. He trusted the advice. He followed through. He did what was hard. It would have been easy not to do it. He did what was hard, and he found out that there's promises to doing what is hard, even when it's difficult. I mean, the other character that didn't do it, well, we read about him earlier. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice, like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And all of a sudden the rain came down, the streams rose, the wind blew against the house, and it fell with a great crash. You probably know people on both sides. You probably know individuals that they checked all the boxes, they read everything, they understood it, they read and they loved, they believed, things were great, and then life happened. A relationship broke, a job was lost, and they felt like this. Their faith, They thought although they believed, they thought everything was going well. And then the rains came, the storms hit the house, and they realized that their faith was feeble and frail and fragile. That without doing things, without exercising the muscle will atrophy. Faith's a muscle that we've got to work out. And practical teaching is something that we have put into play here at the church because we believe at every level that we need to be giving handles around what you do with what you heard. That when it comes to lessons, when it comes to messages, when it comes to Wombaland and Upstreet and Transit, we want to ensure that everybody has handles, because if we just believe and we don't encourage people to do, then what are we doing to help grow and blow up your faith? You see, practical teaching, when Jesus stepped in, he would say, this is what you need to do. This is what it needs to look like. And then he would give them action steps. Say, go and forgive. Hey, before you judge, pull the plank out. Hey, tell you what, why don't why don't you actually turn the other cheek? Why don't you do everything you can to help those around you and not fight for your own personal freedom? What if we lived out the way Jesus taught? You see, there's far too many people in our world today that are far more content just believing and living a life that is unchanged. I don't want that for us. I want us collectively to read and experience what Jesus would teach, and I want us to do. That's why we say on a regular basis that following Jesus makes your life better, and it makes you better at life. Forgiving can be hard, but it restores a relationship. Trusting somebody can be difficult, but when we trust, it helps bridge the gap, right? So when we say following Jesus will make you better at life and it makes your life better, when we put the things Jesus asked into practice, it blows up and it grows up our faith. That is valuable. Not just believing, not just knowing, but would we choose to do? Would you pray with me? God, we love you. And we thank you so much for the fact that you're a big God. And God, I know there's been many times in my life where it is far easier just to check a box of belief. But God, I know that when I read through what you brought about, when I read through the way you challenged those that were closest to you, you were not content with just encouraging them to believe something. You called them to action. You called them to do. So God, I pray that we collectively, that we would wake up every day asking the question, what would it look like if I were absolutely confident that you were in control? And that we would allow our faith to follow through, that we would forgive where it's necessary, that we would extend a helping hand where it's necessary, that when somebody asks for a little jacket, that we would give them the jacket and another jacket and a cloak. God, I pray that we would be known for the way that we follow you. God, we need you for that. God, it's difficult to follow you in a world that continues to leave us empty, but God, would you fill our hearts? And would you show us what it looks like to have confidence that you're with us in every step of the way? God, we love you. We thank you. And God, more than anything, we need you. It is in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen.